Hi everyone, this is Katie from Katie Loves Classic Books, and I'm here today with my November wrap-up. Now, I had a really hard time finding time and space to film during the day, so I apologize that it's nighttime and the lighting isn't as great as natural light. On the plus side though, you get to see the Christmas tree, so that's kind of cool. Very atmospheric for this time of year. Anyways, so let's get to the books I read this month. So the first book I read this month was The 10th Insight by James Redfield, and this was published in 1996, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. Now, this is the second book in a series, the Celestine Prophet series. I read the first book in September, I want to say, and this is the second book. This is a spiritual adventure series, and in the first book, a man went to Peru because this ancient manuscript had been found that kind of detailed better ways for humans to live their lives and better ways for humans to interact with each other and to realize that there's more than the material world. And he went on a whole adventure where he learned about and experienced these concepts. And so in the second book, our same narrator, his friend goes missing, and so he goes to the Appalachian Mountains to find her, and he's kind of thrust on another adventure, and he learns some more insights about life, and he kind of continues on his spiritual journey of growth. And yeah, so this one was a little bit more fantastical than the first book in the series, and it was kind of an interesting viewpoint, though. It dealt a lot with finding your life purpose and how important that is. And that way it kind of reminded me of The Alchemist, because that was a big lesson, I guess, and The Alchemist was kind of about how everybody has a life purpose, and following that is important. And so it dealt a lot with that, and it dealt with some more global issues, like he talks about in this book how the world is kind of polarized. Like, there are people who are discovering better ways we should be living our lives, like the people in these books, and that are more optimistic about the future and can see a world that is better and more at peace, where we're living more in harmony with each other and the natural world, and where we're more in tune to our spiritual selves and in recognizing that there's more to life than this material world, and kind of getting stuck in that way. So he says in this book that there are people who recognize that and that are optimistic about the future of Earth. And of course, these are the people we don't hear about very much in the mainstream, but they're out there. I know that for sure. And then there are people who, are very pessimistic about the world ending, and we see that. We see that in the mainstream news, how things are not going well, and we see all the ways that things could not go well. So it's kind of talked about in this book that there's this polarization between, people giving in to all the bad things happening, and that the world can go in a bad direction, and then that on another level there are people that are optimistic and showing us that there is a way for us to better live our lives. So that's talked about in this book, and shows that we're sort of at a crossroads with that and how it's going to go on Earth. And so anyway, so it was very interesting. I didn't love it as much as the first book, but I still found it very interesting. It's more fantastical, but I thought that was cool. More interesting insight. Like I said, if you watched my review of the first one, This is more for people who are into spirituality and stuff like that. And if you weren't into that, that's totally cool. This isn't for you then. But if you are into that type of thing and you're interested, then I would recommend checking this series out. And of course, starting with the first book, The Celestine Prophecy. The second book I read this month was a bind-up of a few books. And so this is a collection of the short novels of John Steinbeck. And included in here are Tortilla Flat, The Moon is Down, The Red Pony, Of Mice and Men, Cannery Row, and The Pearl. So I read everything in here except Of Mice and Men, because I read Of Mice and Men about a year ago now. So I didn't need to read that again, although I did love it, and perhaps I'll link a written review that I have of that. Yeah, so this was super cool reading so much Steinbeck. I do really like Steinbeck. Previously to reading the short novels in here, I had read, I did read The Pearl before, so that was a reread, and then I've read Of East of Eden, which is one of my favorite books of all time, and then Of Grapes of Wrath, and then Of Mice and Men, like I said. I think I'm going to make a separate video where I review the books in here that I read, because otherwise such a large portion of this video will be taken up reviewing Steinbeck. So if you're interested in my reviews of these Steinbeck short novels and novellas, I will have a review video up of those soon, so just look out for that. The third book I finished this month was The Girls by Emma Cline, and this was published in 2016, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. This follows a 14-year-old girl named Evie Boyd growing up in 1969 in Northern California, and when she comes across this older girl named Suzanne, she becomes involved in an infamous cult. Now, this cult is loosely based on the Charles Manson cult. And while I thought this would be more of an exploration of that cult and cults in particular, this was actually more of an exploration of girlhood and girls coming of age. And it was a brutally honest and very real representation of that, and difficult to read, actually. Emma Cline captured what it's like to come of age as a girl so perfectly, but it's difficult to read as a female. You know, a lot of the things Evie deals with hit so close to home. And I did find this to be a little bit too pessimistic, maybe, about that process, but it was still very, very honest. The time period this is set in is very interesting because the counter, like why people would want to join the counterculture and why people would want to join cults, particularly these girls, because in the Charles Manson cult, you know, it was mostly females. Why would they want to join something like that? And you see, you know, it's the end of the 60s and that kind of happy little suburban family life of the 50s, and all of that is falling away. People are becoming, you know, the youth of that generation are becoming disenchanted with that. You see kind of the breakup of families and what that does to the girls in this generation, and you see that with Evie, and you see how her own female figures, like older female figures in her life, aren't particularly good examples, I guess. And you see how these girls and their vulnerability and their desire to belong and to find themselves and to kind of leave this family life and this society that they just don't really understand and can't really find a place in behind. And you see how they would end up joining a cult like that, and how a cult leader, aka like Charles Manson, they give everyone a different name in this book, though. They call him Russell in this. So you see how Russell, who is based on Charles Manson, how he preys on these girls' vulnerability, and each girl that is part of his cult, he kind of preyed on in a time when she was very vulnerable. And so kind of to understand why these girls would become part of this cult in the first place, and just sort of the issues they're dealing with at this particular period in American history. But also just in general, we don't just get Evie's story in 1969, we also see portions of her life in present day when she's older, and she's caretaking for a friend's house, and that friend's son shows up with his girlfriend, and as older Evie witnesses this girl, Sasha, she sees that not much has changed for girls, that Sasha is just as insecure and vulnerable and wanting of attention and wanting of love as she was when she was 14. And so we see that not much has changed for girls. So this was very interesting. In terms of the Charles Manson murders, like, it does deal with that. So if you are kind of fascinated by that, this is an interesting, like, definitely more fictionalized portrayal of that. I guess mostly if you're interested in why the girls in Manson's cult joined, this is an interesting exploration, or just why anybody would join a cult in that time period. And then most importantly, this is a book about girlhood. And so while I recommend it, to guys as well, I very much recommend this to females, because I feel like what's detailed in this book is just something probably every female can understand and remember from growing up, and this will kind of hit home with them. Anyways, this is Emma Cline's debut novel, and so I'm interested to see what she comes up with next. The fourth book I finished this month was A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and this was published in 1887, and I gave this 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. So this is the first Sherlock Holmes book, and actually have read most of the Sherlock Holmes books. Like, I've read, I think, all of the short story collections. I believe there are 4, and then there's 4 novels, and I had read 2 of them previously, now 3. So now only 1 book left to read. But ironically, I had never read the very first book, which is this one, A Study in Scarlet. And so in this one, we get to see Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson meet for the first time, which was really cool. And I really liked that. And you get to see them, rent their rooms at 221 B Baker Street. And I fully enjoyed that whole meeting between them, and kind of Dr. Watson's observations of Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock's powers of deduction. And then when they're first living together, a mystery comes up for Sherlock Holmes to solve that Scotland Yard can't quite seem to figure out. And it's a case of a man that was found murdered in an abandoned house. And so, as the story goes on, Sherlock Holmes solves the mystery, he solves the murder case, after things escalate a little bit, that is. And it seems like a very typical Sherlock Holmes mystery, and I really enjoyed it. It seemed very cozy. It was all set in Victorian London, and we get to watch Sherlock solve the crime with his powers of deduction, and I love Sherlock Holmes, and I just love his powers of observation, really. And just, when a person walks into a room, like, everything he can gather from them, I just love that. And so that was really fun. And then that part of the story stopped, and I was like, well, that's weird, because he solved the mystery already. But then we get a backstory. We get the story that leads up to this murder and all the other events that happened in London and the murderer's motivation. And that part was totally shocking because it was set in the American West and had to do with early Mormons. And that was probably the most surprising thing I have ever come across in a Sherlock Holmes book. I remember in A Valley of Fear, I believe it is, there is a part like set during maybe the Gold Rush or something like that. I read it a long time ago now, so maybe the American part wasn't so strange. I guess the early Mormon part was really random too, and this was the first Sherlock Holmes book, just a really random story for the first Sherlock Holmes book. But once I got over the initial shock of the complete randomness of that, I actually really liked the backstory. I actually got kind of emotionally invested in it, and I came away from this book with just thinking it was a well-rounded story. You know, we get the wonderful solving of the mystery with Sherlock Holmes, and then we get this backstory that adds like emotional depth to what could otherwise just be like kind of a cold murder case. And so I ended up really liking it and thoroughly enjoyed all of it, even the random parts. And yeah, and I can't wait to read A Sign of Four, I believe it's called. That's the last Sherlock Holmes I have to read. How sad. But I enjoyed reading this and getting to read a Sherlock Holmes book again. And I do recommend this. You don't have to start with this book, obviously, since I didn't. If you are new to Sherlock Holmes, what I really recommend is the novel The How Did the Baskervilles. I think that's still my favorite. And it seems more like a typical Sherlock Holmes story, if that's what you're looking for. But I do recommend this if you want to start at the beginning, because it was good. Just know there are random parts, but I did actually quite love it. The fifth and final book I read this month was The Secret of Shambhala by James Redfield, and this was published in 1999. And yes, this is the third book in the Celestine Prophecy series. So at the end of the month, I found time to pick up this third book because I'm just really liking this series. And I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this one. So in this one, our narrator travels to Tibet this time in search of the legendary land called Shambhala, or Shangri-La, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. And he gets more insights, spiritual insights into how to live life. A big theme in this one is the power of our thoughts. And then he finds the mystical land of Shambhala, or Shangri-La, and that part was really interesting. And again, then it got more fantastical and cool, and I really liked how he depicted Shambhala, or Shangri-La. It was really cool, and I could have read, a longer book with that setting. I thought it was kind of inventive and very interesting. And he kind of shows through Shambhala and Shangri-La, like, a more fantastical yet potential way that our culture on the planet can shift into a more spiritual culture. And I thought that was really interesting. So of course it's more fantastical, but still pretty interesting, and again had some wonderful spiritual life insights. But yet this one felt like kind of a utopian book too, and I just liked it for that reason. It reminded me of Lost Horizon by James Hilton. That's a book from the 30s that I really like. That's also set in the legendary land of Shangri-La, and that is a utopian book. So there definitely was a utopian aspect to this, and I really like this one. I really just am liking this series. There's one book left in the series, so I'm sure I'll pick that up soon. But I think it's just really cool, and there's within these books, there is some really good advice for us, and yet there's a lot of cool fantastical stuff too, and just an optimistic approach for the direction humanity can go in, and I like that. I guess it's refreshing with all this like dystopian stuff out there, which is still interesting. I like reading this optimistic kind of approach with some like insights that we can actually apply to our lives. So I think this series is really cool. Like I said, I've already talked about it with the 10th Insight, which is the second book, but I do recommend this series. And so you'll see a review of the 4th one soon, and then I'll be done, I promise, but they are really interesting. Anyway, so that was my November wrap-up. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to talk to me, or if you've read any of these books, you want to recommend me something, please feel free to comment below. I do have a Patreon account now, which I announced in my last video. So if you would like to support me there, I'll link that below. That'd be really great. It helps me to, you know, get books to read in the first place, and helps to support this channel so I can do more with it. And other than that, if you want to read any written reviews of books, usually I have them on Tumblr and Goodreads, and I will put those 2 sites below. I have some of the reviews there, but not all of them right now. So I started writing for a magazine, and when that's more official, I think my first review should be published this week. When that's more official, I'll have links to that on like my Tumblr and stuff like that, so look out for that there if you're interested in reading those. But I don't have all my reviews of things I've read published now on Tumblr and Goodreads, because some of them I might be wanting to publish for the magazine, because that's going to kind of be a regular thing, I believe. So anyways, so I will link Tumblr and Goodreads below. You can read the reviews that are up there. When I do write for the magazine, you can check that out, and all of that wonderful stuff. Anyways, I'll see you all next time, and I will be back soon with my Steinbeck reviews. Bye!